Aw Yeah Comics celebrates and promotes everything that is wonderful about comics, toys, artwork, and the joy they bring to people. Visit them in person at one of their 3 locations: Harrison, New York, aka my local comic shop, Skokie, Illinois, or Muncie, Indiana. If you have kids and have been looking for a family-friendly store, look no further. Join Aw Yeah for exciting events, including creator signings, how-tos, and more. Visit awyeahcomics.com and follow Aw Yeah on social media for more. Their name says exactly how they feel about it. Say it with me now. Aw yeah. Fat Moose Comics is New Jersey's best and oldest comic book store. Established in 1982 and under new ownership since 2020, Moose sells a wide selection of comics from every publisher and time period, along with action figures, graphic novels, posters, statues, and more. If you're looking for something and they don't have it, they can probably get it for you. They know a guy. Visit Fat Moose in Whippany the next time you're in the Garden State, and be sure to reach out via the Fat Moose Comics Facebook page. In 1986, Clark Kent's comic book history as Superboy was erased with the Man of Steel reboot for the post-crisis era. Then, in 2006, after another crisis, Clark's role as a costumed Boy of Steel was reinstated and explored over a little-remembered animated series and a quartet of comic book storylines from writer Geoff Johns. By 2011, the New 52 relaunch would erase Clark's Superboy once again, but for half a decade, Superboy was back. This is the Superboy Returns Trilogy. Welcome to Digging for Kryptonite, a Superboy fan journey. I'm your host, Anthony Desiato. Joining me to discuss the Geoff Johns Legion of Superheroes Trilogy is one of the hosts of the Comic Binge, returning guest Chris Clow. Welcome back.
Thank you so much for this invitation, Anthony. I really appreciate it.
Well, I know how much affection you have for the post-Infinite Crisis, pre-52 landscape of the DC universe. So that's one of the reasons that you were the perfect guest for this, I felt.
Well, I really appreciate it. No, you're right on the money. I mean, that to me is, it's my era. We always had people coming into the store, and I'm sure you did too, where you always reminisce about the time that you were really into the books and you just want things to evoke that kind of feeling. This is probably that era for me, especially when you're talking about Superman.
Yeah, and since we started our Superboy coverage here, and we're quite a few episodes in at this point, but since we started, I've been particularly curious to get to this stretch of the comics, because since 1986's Man of Steel reboot from John Byrne, the idea of Clark as Superboy in the comics was dormant, save for the Pocket Universe and a couple of alternate reality appearances in the pages of the Connor Kent Superboy series, and we've talked about all of that. But then, at the end of Infinite Crisis in 2006, we get the reinstatement of Clark's history as Superboy, as a costumed Superboy, albeit not a globally known version of the character, but rather this rural myth that is referenced in a number of stories and then more fully explored over this trio of stories that you and I are here to talk about. And I had a particular reaction to these stories and the Superboy of it all at the time. And I don't think this will shock you or the audience. I wasn't super happy about it. This idea of Clark as Superboy coming back. And again, I think also unsurprisingly, my perspective now has shifted a lot. And so I've been really curious to get to this stretch of the comics in this coverage because I now can come at it from a completely different vantage point. Now, I said that we're covering the Geoff Johns Legion of Superheroes trilogy. Chris, is there a collection or a line of trades out there labeled as such, or a storyline on the DC app that's called the Geoff Johns Legion of Superheroes trilogy?
Not to my knowledge, but there sure as hell should be. I mean, God, I can't wait to get into this, but I mean, the amount of legwork that's done, not only bringing back the pre-crisis Superboy effectively the pre-crisis Superboy into the mainline continuity, but the interweaving that all of these stories do, not just between Superman and Legion related titles, but also The Flash, also Infinite Crisis, Green Lantern. Most of it, a lot of it, or I should say, comes together within Legion of Three Worlds. But this is pretty well as close as you can get to a DC Universe tour de force that is led by Superman and the Legion. And just the implications of all of that stuff, particularly in the moment, made for such rewarding storytelling for anybody who was invested in the DC universe. Final Crisis kind of came along and was an alternate path on this broader journey that Johns had been building in his other titles. But I mean, you have Teen Titans in there too that's woven in. I mean, there's so much here. The density of this, if you wanted to sort of expand the web of the stories that all of this stuff is referential to, it's pretty mind-boggling. And maybe that would make a pretty cool omnibus unto itself.
Oh man, I could not agree more. And that was one of the things that struck me as I was rereading these stories for the first time in quite some time, to be honest, was not just how they build off of each other, but how they do build upon and further threads from other stories that Johns was telling and from other writers as well across the DC universe. So yes, there's a lot there. And again, the Legion trilogy is not something that's officially labeled or collected as such, but it's this trio of stories that fans have recognized as forming this sort of mega arc that Johns was telling in the reintroduction of the pre-crisis Legion of Superheroes team, aka the retroboot version of the team, as well as Clark's history as Superboy with the Legion. So the three stories that we're talking about here are the Lightning Saga, which was a 5-part crossover between Justice Society of America by Geoff Johns and Dale Eaglesham, and Justice League of America by Brad Meltzer, Shane Davis, and Ed Benes, and that was in 2007. Then, at the end of 2007 into 2008, we have a 6-part arc in Action Comics called Superman and the Legion of Superheroes by Geoff Johns and Gary Frank. And then finally, across 2008 and 2009, I do remember there being delays on this, there was the 5-part miniseries Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds by Geoff Johns and the late, great George Pérez. And so again, when you take all of these together, they really do form this very effective trilogy of stories that I think does a great job of showing, certainly, yes, the effect that a young Clark Kent had on the Legion of Superheroes, but probably more so the effect that they had on him and that deep camaraderie, friendship, bond that exists between them.
Yeah, the thing that I was kind of with you in terms of at the time being a little bit iffy on the idea of a costumed Superboy becoming canon again in the present day DCU. But I think the creative teams here do a really good job of explaining the necessity that that Clark had for this kind of camaraderie. You know, and could he have had it without a costume? Maybe, but when you're doing comic book storytelling, I mean, the ability to bring in different elements of the mythology and different eras of the mythology to tell a new story. And Johns has always excelled at these kinds of justifications for long-standing tenets of older stories. This is just like a reading opportunity that aligned, and I imagine a really rewarding creator opportunity for all of these creators when they were making these books. You're just bringing in so many things, and you would think that the incongruity of multiple legions that have existed over the past, 25 years or so before this would create something that might make certain creators steer clear of doing stories like these. But by invoking them, Johns is kind of exercising the same kind of continuity gymnastics that he pulled with something like Green Lantern Rebirth, where I think Brad Meltzer said it in the intro to the collected edition on that story. It would be so easy to kill one of the main Earth Green Lanterns. But taking a different path, you're incorporating all of these characters to do something by pushing things forward, hearkening back to something we've seen before while still managing to say something new. All of these stories fit that kind of mentality to a T. So I really appreciate the invocation of a pre-crisis continuity while wanting to say something new and interweaving all of these other concurring elements of the DC universe at this time. You needed to read these books to stay up with what was happening, but also you get rewarding stories along the way with it that I think have stood the test of time very well.
Well said. And kind of along those lines, one of the other big things I was struck by as I was rereading these stories was again, these came right after the second or middle crisis, as it's referred to in these stories here. So even in these stories, right, we were building towards Final Crisis. They knew that Infinite Crisis wasn't it. But you have these stories in the wake of another continuity-altering crisis. But they felt to me, to your point, in keeping with honoring what had come before, while also incorporating the revisions that had taken place, as opposed to other reboots or quasi-reboots that we've seen since, where I come away from some of the subsequent stories saying, okay, I'm not quite sure exactly what's in and what's not, and I can get past that. It's not the hill I'm going to die on, but as someone who's been following all of this stuff, we do want to kind of have that thread that we can follow. And so I feel like these stories really did a great job of, again, incorporating those revisions without kind of discarding much. Like, it really felt like it was honoring the scope of the stories that had come before, and maybe in an even more powerful way. Because to your point, now I think that's the biggest thing with this post Infinite Crisis era, was bringing back a lot that had been lost over time.
Certainly, and also too, though, I think another element that just makes these stories compelling. This effectively served as my introduction to the Legion. And I feel like these stories, I think JOHNS sensed that readers of the time maybe had grown, if not outright unaware, then at least unfamiliar with that side of the DCU, because it is an entirely other section of the DCU. It's an entirely other era. And it provides some really unique opportunities to reference things that are happening now in a past tense. But, the Legion had kind of fallen out of prominence in the previous 3 years, really since Mark Waid jumped on in 2004 with the threeboot. And by kind of using the pre-crisis Legion to plant a flag in the ground and start to introduce the concept of the world again, he created a whole new generation of Legion fans. And I can say that with certainty because I'm one of them.
So that's one of the big picture things I wanted to talk to you about, is your history with the Legion of Superheroes, which obviously you've already started to lay out for us. And I was reflecting on my own. So again, one of the stories here is called the Legion of Three Worlds. When we talk about the three legions that are in play here, there's that pre-crisis version that gets reintroduced in this trilogy of stories and has come to be known as the retroboot version. These stories were my introduction to that version of the Legion. Then there's the post-Zero Hour reboot version. In really thinking about this, that's the Legion that I certainly met first, given the period of time when I was originally reading the books. And really, I encountered them whenever they crossed paths with Superman in the super titles. And probably the most notable instance of this was during the final night. And that's actually referenced in an epilogue issue to Superman and the Legion of Superheroes, where Batman confronts Superman. And he's like, history's always changing. I've met 3 different legions. What the hell is going on? And that's one of the instances that's cited. So that's the version of the Legion that I met, but I never read their solo stories. I mean, I remember, again, both of us having history working at comic shops. I mean, I remember especially when the Dan Abnett, Andy Lanning, Legion Lost stories were going on. I know that was big. I remember seeing that at the shop, but I never delved into it. But that's the Legion that I guess I knew first. And probably the Legion I knew best was the threeboot version, the iteration of the team introduced by Mark Waid and Barry Kitson in 2004 that ran for a few years. Eventually it became Supergirl and the Legion of Superheroes. I did not stick with it all the way through, but I remember reading it at the outset. I think the allure of a reboot and a number one and Mark Waid, I think that was the trifecta that was like, okay, I'll check this out. And I liked it well enough. I don't really have anything against Barry Kitson's art, but I think I was looking for something a little bit more dynamic, for lack of a better word, on the art side. And it just didn't really grab me in that sense. And I kind of fell off of it. But yeah, I would say that's the Legion I knew best. The post-Zero Hour reboot is the Legion I knew first. And then this retroboot version now is probably the version that I am the biggest fan of, except for the animated version, which we talked about last week, which has now fast become my number one take on the team. But yeah, so we have all these ones floating around. So you said this trilogy was your introduction to the Legion, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, when I came back into reading comics full time since being a kid, it was 2005. It was effectively Batman Begins that brought me back into the fold. And I'd always had what you could probably politely refer to as an obsession with superhero stories, but had never just read the comics consistently since, being a 10-year-old and picking JLA #1 up off the rack and not knowing who Grant Morrison was, but loving that book. Um, so '05 comes along and, I have to go through something of a crash course to get up to date with an abundance of titles across both Marvel and DC the opportunity presents itself to start working as a retailer. So, in the crash course that I took of probably about, I mean, I still had a really good understanding of the DC universe and its history pre and post crisis, but the specific sequences of events were the things I needed to get up to speed on. And the Legion just wasn't a part of that. I think part of that was because when my manager, hi Roman, uh, put me aside and gave me some pointers about things to pay attention to, a lot of it was based off of books that were being published at the time. And the Legion just wasn't a part of that really in any significant sense. I think we had ordered a few issues monthly of Supergirl and the Legion of Superheroes, but it was not a priority and we weren't really getting any shelf copies either. So I had a blind spot, really. I mean, I was aware of the Legion primarily because of Superman the animated series. The episode "New Kids in Town" was where the Legion showed up, and they had a couple of appearances in JLU as well, I believe, or maybe at least one.
At least one, the Far From Home episode towards the end when Supergirl goes to live with them.
Yeah, exactly. So the intersection for me and the Legion actually really began again with JOHNS when the threeboot began in '04. The back issues I had done in reading Teen Titans led me there because there is a brief Teen Titans Legion crossover where Connor is flung into the future. And it was a really fun story, a really good story, I think. First issue is in Teen Titans, I think number 16, that's written by JOHNS with Mike McKone on art. And then the Teen Titans Legion crossover special was written by JOHNS and Waid together. And I think Ivan Reis was an artist on that. So that was like, oh, this is the Legion. This is the modern Legion. This is pretty cool. And then about a year into my tenure working at the or about 6 months into my tenure working as a retailer, that's when the Lightning Saga came out.
Right on. I remember that Teen Titans story that you're talking about. And next year we are going to shine the spotlight on Connor Kent, and we will touch on his experience with the Legion as well. So we will get there, but I know exactly what you're talking about. But
please call me when you do, if you don't mind.
Right on. But that's the thing that I was reflecting on, because given, again, the era that you and I were growing up in, and the fact that we had time before we got to this trilogy of stories, which restores that connection between Superman and the Legion. I grew up, I met not one, but two versions of the Legion of Superheroes divorced from Superman or Superboy. And so I guess for years, I just had this sense of them as a team from the future, and nothing wrong with that. But I guess, yeah, it never totally grabbed me. And so I think that's probably the biggest thing, is I'm reading these stories and reading them now in the context of everything that we've been covering. And we've looked at those stories where Clark spent time with them in the future. And now it just has this added weight to it, given that connection point. So yeah, like I said, the perspective has definitely shifted. Now, like I said, at the time when Clark's history as Superboy was reinstated at the end of Infinite Crisis and then further explored in these stories, I wasn't the happiest camper. Next week, we're going to devote the episode to Superman's Secret Origin, and we'll get into all of that in much greater detail. But all of this starts to unfold towards the end of Infinite Crisis in issue number 6, when Alexander Luthor has been working to bring back the multiverse and assemble the perfect Earth. And then, of course, you have that climactic battle, that fatal battle between Superboy, Connor Kent, and Superboy Prime that results in the destruction of Alexander Luthor's tower. And then you have all of these Earths converging into New Earth. And you see these shards of history as this is happening. And the three prominent ones that are highlighted there, you see a newspaper headline about Joe Chill, right? So on the Batman front, now we've had this change. We had years where it wasn't known who murdered the Waynes, and now we're back into Joe Chill territory. We also have a shard about Wonder Woman being one of the founders of the Justice League, because we had a whole post-crisis era where that wasn't the case. It was Black Canary, and we had JLA Year One by Mark Waid and Barry Kitson. And right smack in the middle of that page, if memory serves, was this image of a young Clark in a Superboy costume with Krypto next to him standing in front of a Welcome to Smallville sign. And that was the first instance that, oh, Clark's history as Superboy has been reinstated. And then in the next issue, in Infinite Crisis number 7, Alexander Luthor actually articulates exactly what I just laid out and talks about in the Superman category, specifically how now there have been recorded appearances of Superman before his official debut in Metropolis. So we have that. Then there's that story that I know you are fond of, Up, Up, and Away, that kicked off the 1 year later era in the Superman titles. And that starts with Clark and Lois and Jimmy watching a movie about Superman, a documentary type movie. And there's reference there to fleeting glimpses of the rural myth, the Superboy. You might have a crisper memory of this than I do. Were there many, if any, other types of those references in the super books at the time, separate, of course, from this trilogy that we're talking about, but other references here and there to like the Superboy? Do you remember?
I don't remember if there's a specific reference to I love a rural myth, because of course Superman was a rural myth, or Superboy, I should say. In Action Comics number 850, which I believe was a Busiek issue, that was the first hint at the fact that the origin of Superman was different than we remember it to be. Good friend of mine, Neil Bailey, who's a longtime contributor to the Superman homepage, he was a tireless investigator in the status of Superman's origin post-crisis. And he finally got, I think it was, it must have been 2007, maybe it was 2006, where he finally got Kurt Busiek to admit, well, what's the origin? Is it Man of Steel? Is it Birthright? Is it some sort of, amalgamation of the two? And Busiek said, there is no origin. So that was the first hint that the path had been laid bare for a story like Secret Origin to come along. There may have been a reference to the Legion, that because Action 850 was really the first time that the origin had been mentioned in a past context to something that had actually happened that we just had not seen yet. So there might have been a reference there.
Gotcha.
All that to say, I mean, it's so fun to talk, because they were like figuring it out too. And it's just fun to think about, like, wow, we're on the cusp of a revised Superman origin. This is really interesting, especially if you like that story.
Right. And at the time, and I guess I'll talk more about this next week, but at the time, I was very, very much in line with the Birthright iteration of the origin. I still am. It's still my preferred origin. And
Sure.
So the idea that we were moving away from that didn't sit well with me, particularly at the time. It's interesting to me that we don't actually get Superman's secret origin until after all these stories that you and I are going to talk about. And these stories lay out a lot of the pieces that we will see later and see them expanded upon in Secret Origin, especially in those first couple of issues where you see Clark's time in Smallville. But there are things that are referenced in the Lightning Saga. Clark is talking to Stargirl, and he talks about how he broke someone's arm playing football when he was a teenager. And then you see that play out in Secret Origin. But it's just funny. Again, now we're rereading this. We know where we're going. We know that we're getting to Secret Origin, but you can see clearly Johns knew where he was going with this origin story that we would eventually get to. But I don't know, it's a curious choice to me to hold off on actually showing that origin until so deep into the proceedings.
I feel like it was a smart move, particularly sales-wise, because once the cat was out of the bag that there was no predominant origin of Superman, everybody wanted to see it. And I think they spent a lot of time building the anticipation by that point, of course, Gary Frank was already a well-known entity when it comes to Superman specifically, but also a well-loved creator because of the way that he renders these characters. So when they finally did announce Superman's Secret Origin, additionally, that was also on the heels of Green Lantern's Secret Origin that unfolded in the main monthly title there, also written by JOHNS with beautiful art by Ivan Reis. And that was a really smart kind of intersection with a lot of the things he would end up doing with Superman. So in terms of just building the anticipation for us to finally see the new genesis of Superman, no pun intended, I think it was it was definitely highly anticipated, and I was certainly in there. I was ready to see what this, because you're adding a lot of pressure to it. There's a lot of things that it needs to sort of reconcile. So on just like the curiosity front, the creative team front, the interest in the origin story front, liking good artwork, all of those things just kind of combined into I'm ready for Superman's Secret Origin.
No, honestly, all of that is fair. And to your point, as I was reading, especially Lightning Saga, probably more than the others, I was really reminding myself, like, yeah, we didn't have Secret Origin yet. This is when we were getting the first real inkling as to what the new history was. When Clark starts talking about his friends from the future, it's like, oh. So yes, there is something about that, about really kind of feeding that mystery and building the intrigue. So I do hear you on that. And along the lines of your friend Neil Bailey's efforts, I have undertaken similar efforts recently to determine what DC considers to be the official origin at this point in time, because this is something that has come up in our conversations. My contention has been that in the post-Doomsday Clock DCU and the work that Geoff Johns did there, and we'll touch upon that again next week. We did a whole episode on Doomsday Clock, but we'll circle back to that next week. My contention has been that Superman's Secret Origin is once again the de facto origin story for the character. I won't reveal my sources, but I did reach out to DC Comics, and I did get a confirmation that generally speaking, they do consider Superman's Secret Origin to be the origin at this point in time.
I think that makes sense. I mean, considering the reshuffling that they did during Rebirth, and specifically the story that was co-written by Peter Tomasi and Dan Jurgens, it seemed to invoke a fair amount of visual similarity in terms of the character designs to what we saw in Secret Origin. Obviously, that was partially derived from the original movies, but still, it seemed like what had happened was, the New 52 came along, Grant Morrison did what they did when it comes to reshaping that version of Superman, but then he dies at the end of the New 52. The pre-Flashpoint Superman managed to survive that universal transition. There was nothing to indicate that his origin would not be the Johns Frank book. So it was restored by then. And then in the crossover story, they picked and chose from a lot of the major visual and thematic cues in the display of the early years. So that seemed to install it there. And since then, I haven't seen anything that outright contradicts what was reshuffled there. So I think it's a pretty logical approach until the next creator comes along with a potentially striking vision for it. Maybe accepting Absolute Superman, although, we'll see how that goes.
Oh, yes. We'll keep our eye on that recently announced initiative. But anyway, there you have it, audience. We got an answer from DC. It was something that I wanted to try to dig into a little bit.
You are doing a service to Superman fans everywhere. So thank you for doing the digging.
It's my pleasure. Now, the last, I guess, big picture question before we get into these stories more specifically, which is, and again, this is maybe more of a question for next week for Secret Origin, but I think it is particularly relevant here because in terms of what Johns does, I mean, Johns is really the one who does almost all of the work with Clark as Superboy, with this reinstated history in this half a decade stretch between Infinite Crisis and the New 52. I know there's also an arc of Adventure Comics that Paul Levitz wrote. That's a flashback story that shows Superboy with the Legion. But really, other than that, it's all Johns. And really, with the exception of the first issue of Secret Origin, virtually all of what Johns does in terms of mining Clark as Superboy, it's all within the space of the Legion and these future set stories, and not Clark as Superboy operating in Smallville. I don't even know what my question is necessarily. I think after the experience I've had, especially with that 1980s New Adventures of Superboy comic book series and those Filmation Superboy cartoons, there is a charm and an appeal to those Smallville set Superboy stories that I can't deny, even as I continue to recognize the strengths of the argument against having him operate in public view like that. But there's a charm to those stories of the Kent General Store and Clark at Smallville High in his red sweater and changing into Superboy in the tunnel, although they do have the tunnel under the house here and all that. But all that to say that what we get here, it really seems like the reason Johns brought Superboy back was as a path to Superboy and the Legion, as opposed to those Smallville set stories. And maybe at least part of that, obviously we don't know, and we can't speak for it, but maybe part of that is if you do those Smallville set stories, then you lose that moment of the public debut that I think Johns wanted to preserve, and you get that in Secret Origin. So we end up with this balance, I suppose, where Clark is in Smallville in a Superboy costume, but operating largely in secret. And to whatever extent he's known, it's this myth, this suburban or rural myth. No one knows him to the extent that they did in Pre-Crisis. So again, you preserve that public debut. I don't know. It's like, and I don't know. I continue to wrestle with this because part of me is like, well, if you were a big fan of Pre-Crisis Superboy, does this give you enough of what you want? I don't know. And if you're not a fan of Pre-Crisis Superboy, as I wasn't at the time, then I'm just like, why the hell are we doing this? So I don't know, because part of me looks at it and I say to myself, and thank you for bearing with me on this, but part of me looks at this and I say to myself, I appreciate the balance that he was striving for here, where you get him back in a Superboy costume, you get all these Legion stories, but you still have that graduation level moment that I'm always talking about when he shows up in Metropolis and he becomes Superman. Like you manage to thread the needle and keep all of that. But I don't know. Like I said, depending on which camp you're in, I don't know if it gives you enough either way. And so it sort of ends up being this in-between thing.
I think what you're speaking about really does speak to the strengths and weaknesses of a pivotal device that is used in comic book narrative storytelling, that is the floating timeline. The balance, I think, is the critical point that you make, because for those who may have been against the idea, like you were at the time, of a pre-crisis costumed Superboy operating in relatively modern times, Johns may have felt, and I don't know because I've never asked him about it, but he may have felt that that might have been a bridge too far. What's the likelihood that he would be able to stay under the radar in a small town wearing that suit? It's pretty minimal. So if you are instead pivoting to say, well, he was Superboy, but he was just in the future where he's already a known entity and he's establishing these friendships, then you do get to thread the needle, as you said. And that's not to say that I would be against a Smallville Superboy story during this time. I mean, we got hints of what he was up to, but like in terms of supporting an ongoing book, for instance, I think there would have been plenty of room to have something primarily led by Clark, sort of like Adventures of Superman. He's Clark Kent for 15 minutes, and then the last 5 minutes he's Superman, right? You could have probably done something like that, and I think it would have been really cool to see. But you also run the risk of overexposure of the concept, and Johns was playfully cagey about providing details of his forthcoming Legion adventures at the time. So maybe he didn't want to spread the concept too thin. But I think it really, at the end of the day, was a question of balance, appeasing those who may not have been particularly supportive of the return of a Smallville Superboy, and the sort of weird melding that modern day DCU stories had to do between the sort of bleed between Infinite Crisis, the post-crisis era, and the pre-crisis era that the universe was starting to become at that point. And that's a long answer. I'm sorry, but those are all the concepts that have to be determined to chart a path in the narrative, I think.
Yeah, no. I appreciate your take, and I think that certainly accounts for why we landed where we did. You know, whether that was the quote unquote right call or not, people's mileage will vary on that depending on their perspective. Yeah. And then the other thing too is that it's such a discrete period of time here. It's this half a decade stretch before Superboy's erased from continuity again. 52. And then of course reinstated with Doomsday Clock. But to date, nothing has been done with that, to my knowledge at least. So again, that's why I remain fascinated by this 5-year period of time when we got this trilogy. And so on that note, we start this trilogy. Again, we had Infinite Crisis. We have those shards. We have these couple of mentions of the Superboy. And then we have the first act of this 3-part story, the Lightning Saga, this crossover between Brad Meltzer's Justice League and Geoff Johns' Justice Society. And essentially the premise of this is that 7 Legionnaires have been sent back in time to the present day DCU on a mystery mission. And due to a combination of a mental block that Brainiac implanted to shield their mission from Saturn Girl, as well as the disorienting effects of time travel generally, they've lost their memories and they're very confused. And so much of the story is about the League and the Society tracking down these members by tracking their flight rings and using this interlac code to sort of wake them up, and all while trying to sort out exactly what the true nature of their presence in that period of time is. And so the Legionnaires in question are Starman, Karate Kid, Dream Girl, Wildfire, Timberwolf, Dawnstar, and Censor Girl. And the breadcrumbs for this were placed in the initial arcs of both Justice League and Justice Society, because in Meltzer's first arc on Justice League, The Tornado's Path, the League fights the villain Trident. And then at the end of that story, as Batman is examining him in the Batcave and runs his vitals through the Bat computer or whatnot, he gets a hit, right? There's a match for one of the Fortress files for Karate Kid, this member of the futuristic Legion of Superheroes. So you have that breadcrumb in the pages of Justice League. And then over in Justice Society, we have this Starman character who is clinically insane and living at a mental hospital and claims to be from the future. So the seeds were planted right in those initial arcs, and then they start to converge in this crossover. So, I mean, I guess just overall impressions of this Lightning Saga.
Oh, just brilliant. I mean, you mean of the beginning or of the story overall?
Just wherever you want to go with it.
Oh, 1 year later was a very special era for me, or initiative, I should say, because it really provided a unique opportunity to jump on with books that I would never have considered before, and to engage in conversations with people about a wide variety of material in the DC Universe line. So I just have a lot of fond memories on that basis for both the beginning of Justice League of America Volume 2 and Justice Society of America Volume 3. And that was really, like, I had read a fair amount of JSA issues before, primarily Johns and Goyer, but jumping on at Justice Society of America #1, it just further reinforced how important they are to the fabric of this entire shared universe. So that was fun. I really enjoyed Tornado's Path. I know people are sort of hot and cold on it today, but in terms of giving the League an excuse to reforge after being broken at the end of Infinite Crisis, or leading into Infinite Crisis, I should say, I really enjoyed it. It seemed to just illustrate this kind of necessity that obviously the big three understand the importance of being able to get together, but the exercise they undertake to figure out who's actually going to be on the team's roster, I just was so charmed by that first story, especially coming off of Brad Meltzer's utter deconstruction of the Justice League and Identity Crisis. It was just like totally in the opposite direction, and I was very, very there for it. But there were some misses with 1 year later, one of them being The Flash, which is very unfortunate because The Flash is a key component of the DC universe. But Wally was gone at the end of Infinite Crisis, and very much like Wally was set up at the end of Crisis on Infinite Earths to become the next Flash, Bart was set up similarly at the end of Infinite Crisis. The series went where it did. It was a hell of a deviation from the Bart Allen that we had grown to know over the past, 15 years up to that point as Impulse and then as Kid Flash, and ended rather unceremoniously after 13 issues. First 6 of which I think were Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, who did the Flash TV show, and then Mark Guggenheim came aboard to actually finish it out. Rather shocking ending of Bart being murdered by the Rogue, something they vowed they wouldn't do. But while that series ended with a thud, little did we know that threads were being planted at that point for the story that we're talking about now. And the Flash element of it is kind of a phantom angle on the Lightning Saga because it doesn't really come into full view until the end of that story, but it ends up being a very important thread that persists through the end of this trilogy. Not so much in the middle part, but it's very important to parts 1 and 3. And, it was really fun to see how that stuff was going to unfold because the Flash was in kind of a weird spot during this time.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and we don't need to beat around the bush. These stories are old enough. We have the return of Wally West and his family at the end of the Lightning Saga, and then the return not just of Kid Flash, but of Connor Kent in the pages of Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds. So that's why, like you and I were saying at the top, again, these stories certainly feed into each other, but they also pay off threads from all these other stories from the DC universe at the time. I think probably, honestly, the biggest thing, at least thematically, that struck me as I was reading Lightning Saga, to your point about Brad Meltzer, as I've delved deeper into pre-crisis comics, for example, and especially the team books that I read, and we looked at a lot of those crisis type stories between the crossovers between the Justice League and the Justice Society in the decades leading up to Crisis on Infinite Earths. And one of the things that I've complained about, while recognizing the limitations and the sensibilities of the day, right, is how when we're dealing with those team books in particular, the characters all feel largely interchangeable, right, in terms of what they're saying. It never really feels all that particular, especially in the Silver Age. I think as we get maybe deeper into the Bronze Age that you get a little bit more of a shift. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but generally speaking, that was one of kind of my overall views as I was going through some of those pre-crisis stories. It's the exact opposite here. What Meltzer is able to do, and JOHNS as well in this crossover, but especially in those Meltzer issues, is just like he did in Identity Crisis. And this is the part of Identity Crisis that that continues to resonate with me, that I think is its greatest strength, is really looking at these characters as people and as a community. And their personalities are on full display. And you get just so many character moments that are at once unexpected, yet totally ring true. And you're like, oh, of course. There's a great double page spread when the League and the Society come together, and you get all of these little exchanges on this double page spread. You have Stargirl sort of fangirling out to Wonder Woman, as an example. You have Dr. Midnight telling Black Canary, oh, leadership suits you because she's the leader of the League at this time. And as a fellow fan of that previous 90s, early 2000s JSA series where they had a romance, I was like, oh, that's great. Like, that's a great callback. You get this very interesting bit of business between Batman and Power Girl over this collector's item that they're talking about. And she's like, it's not for sale, Bruce. You have Superman telling a very old, corny joke to Jay Garrick, who's like, that joke's even older than me, son. And you even get Hal and Hawkman debating whether the Green Lantern ring is science or magic. And that's just an example, but I think that double page spread is a great encapsulation of what Meltzer does so well. And again, JOHNS as well in this crossover of really treating these characters like people and also showing how there is space for both of these teams in the DC universe. The League might be sort of this strike force, for lack of a better term, but the Society is there as the example, as the mentors, as the trainers, and they can all kind of have their spot in the DC universe. So really throughout this 5-part crossover, separate from the pre-crisis Legion is getting introduced and why are they back in the present day and what are all these hints we're getting about Superman's history with them, that aside, those interpersonal dynamics and moments, I think that's what stood out to me the most.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I mean, we saw what happens when a tight-knit community is thrust into a crisis that threatens all of them. And it's this really nerve-wracking reading experience and really just perilous. That's the word that comes to my mind the most when I think of Identity Crisis. Just every issue feels so perilous, especially at the end. Like Meltzer was just a master of that kind of tension. And then here we see the other side of that. We see the camaraderie. We see the intersection of different interests or the other side of interests of individual characters explored just very, very succinctly. And there's a great intimation of the history between everybody. I'm pretty sure, don't quote me on this, but the joke that Superman told, wasn't it the same joke that Ralph Dibny told at the beginning of Identity Crisis?
Yes.
So then you have the poetry, the rhyming between the two stories, even though they are very, very different from one another. It's such a fun, and it's also refreshing as fans of all of these characters to see them like this, because I think the first issues of both Justice League and Justice Society from Johns and Meltzer respectively, or Meltzer and Johns respectively, I should say, did a good job of justifying why both sides are needed. Johns hit it a lot harder in his first couple of issues of the new JSA series by actually having the League show up in the opening pages of the first issue, if I'm remembering correctly, explaining, what we do and how it's not the same as what you guys do, but what you guys do is just as, if not more important than what we do. And the team roster on the JSA side had a veritable showing of up-and-coming heroes alongside those seasoned veterans. And it was just a really great mesh of the future, current, and prior generations that the League never really needs to represent. The League is always now, whereas the JSA is past, present, and future. And I think that's one of the things that makes it feel so well-rounded, particularly as a complement to the Justice League.
Absolutely. That's one of the things in recent years in the DC universe that I have really missed is that strong presence of the Justice Society. And I know that as we speak, we're in the midst of this new golden age, and we've had a trio of miniseries focusing on core Justice Society characters, and Johns himself has been writing this, I was going to say year-long, but it's taken more than a year to come out, but a 12-issue Justice Society series. I will admit I haven't read it yet. I'm waiting until it's done, and I plan to dive in. But, man, those days, this is a separate episode or maybe a separate podcast, and maybe I'll do it at some point, but those days from the relaunch of JSA in the late 90s, and man, I was meeting all those characters for the first time. I didn't know who any of these people were as a what was I, 12, 11 or 12 when those comics were first coming out.
But he gave you a reason to care. And he does the same thing with the Legion in these stories.
That's the thing. But I have so much fondness. We were talking off mic about, the memories that summer conjures and going back to certain stories that we read. And I look back so fondly on those days when I was getting into JSA, and I love that series so much. And the 1 year later Justice Society of America series, I enjoyed that as well. I didn't get as much mileage out of it as I think I did that initial JSA series, but I love that whole era. And I always want to see those characters highlighted and have a place of prominence in the DCU because they earn it. But with Lightning Saga in particular, again, those interpersonal moments really sing for me. There's another one that kind of segues into the Legion of it all, where it's when, again, over the course of the story, you have the League and the Society team up and divide into these subgroups to track down these time-displaced Legionnaires, to try to wake them up, remind them of who they are, why they're there, and just all try to get a sense of exactly what's going on here. And so you have a team that's going to Thanagar to track down Dawnstar. And while they're flying there, I think it's Roy Harper, Red Arrow in this story, who's talking about how, normally in a situation like this, there's an initial misunderstanding and a fist fight, and then we all figure it out and it's okay. He goes, but here, it's all been very diplomatic so far, so to speak. And he's like, so what's going to happen next? And I love that because it's obviously a bit meta, but it's also kind of true, right? Like that is the typical pattern that these follow. So there is this air certainly of mystery, but there's kind of just like this ominous spirit to the proceedings because it's like, where are we going here with this? And hand in hand with that, while I'm talking about Roy, you've got this budding romance between Roy and Kendra, Hawkgirl. You've got this revelation of a sexual encounter between Power Girl and Hawkman when they were on Thanagar rebuilding in the year leading up to 1 year later. So again, just a lot of stuff, once again, in terms of treating these characters as people and having workplace romances, essentially. So all that stuff was great, I thought. But then again, and we're getting at this earlier, throughout the story, you get these glimpses into Clark's past with them. The fact that he's got files on Karate Kid, for example, in the Fortress database, that Karate Kid is listed as a higher class fighter than Batman, which was a nice little bit that's thrown in there. I guess the first really big moment is when you have the team led by Superman that goes to the Fortress to track down, there are actually two flight ring signals that they trace there. There's Superman's, and then there's the one that ends up belonging to Wildfire, who's been essentially imprisoned as a statue there as part of the Fortress display before he's woken up with that Interlac code. But he has this conversation with Stargirl and Cyclone, and he talks about how, you guys are lucky to have each other. When I was a kid, I was the only one who could fly. And that's when he has that bit about I broke someone's arm. And, we know that's Pete Ross. We'll see that play out in Secret Origin. He talks about how when he was with the Legion, he's like, every one of them could fly. And he's like, they were my friends. And again, you see all the statues of them. So like I said, it's easy now to look at this. We know Secret Origin. We know all of the stories that we're talking about here. But this was when you were first learning what the post-Infinite Crisis history of the character was.
Yeah, and it was riveting. There's no other way I could put it. I mean, the idea of a young Clark being something of a loner was not new per se, but I think there is something to be said about the depth at which it's explored in these stories in particular, because yes, naturally exhibiting the things that Clark Kent can do would be somewhat isolating naturally, but getting into his head to kind of talk about the emotional reality of what it is actually like. I mean, even if Clark on his best day fit in well with his friends at school, he still had this internal understanding of how different he was. And then when he goes to the 30th century or 31st century and things change, that is entirely taken away. He's given a whole new sense of camaraderie and understanding that he never had before. He never knew what it was like to be like everyone else. And I think that really justifies the important role that the Legion plays in this conception of Superman, because Superman, you could argue, is the ultimate symbol of authority and of belonging. He is the mainstream superhero who's known to everybody. But if he didn't have that grounding of the Legion and an understanding of what it's like to be part of that broader community at a critical time when he's coming of age, who knows how he would have turned out? Maybe his countenance would have been more like Bruce Wayne's if he didn't have that sense of belonging at that point in his life. So adding that additional context and emotional weight, and I feel emotional reality to the conception of the character as he was during this time, it does so many favors, and it completely and that, and I've talked about this before on this show, how insecure I still feel because of how much defending of Superman I needed to do during my time as a retailer. So those arguments, when they were coming at me fast and furious about how he's a character with no pathos and nothing can harm him, these stories written by, at that time, comics' hottest writer, completely undercut any argument that tried to say that Superman was a character without pathos and without an emotional inroad to try and understand who he is and where he's coming from. So on that basis, it was really valuable, but also just the reality of living with the character in your head as a longtime devotee of him and his stories. Like, it adds another level of dimension that doesn't undo anything about him that you have seen or read before. And I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And it's one of those things where I remind myself of what a shift this was for me at the time, because growing up in the post-crisis era, Clark's a football star in high school in Man of Steel. And then later, when we got to that post-Zero Hour storyline and they introduce one of my favorites, Kenny Braverman, aka Conduit, you get this added backstory. Not only was he a football star, but he just excelled at everything. Athletics, academics. He was just like the big man on campus. And that's a completely different flavor. What you see here in this post-crisis, post-Infinite Crisis landscape where Clark was this outsider. And I know I'm jumping ahead here, but there's that incredible moment in Superman and the Legion of Superheroes when he's confronting Earthman and then their final battle. And Earthman, one of the Legion rejects who didn't make it when he tried out for the team, he's like, you don't know what it's like to be rejected. You don't know what it's like to be an outsider. And Superman, as he cleans his clock, is like, I've been an outsider every day of my life. So again, thematically tying all of this together, that he is this outsider, but then he has this opportunity to tap into this different part of himself and this camaraderie. And twofold, right? Like, he's learning how to use his powers. He's developing physically, but also just being able to express himself, being himself in a way that he can't at home. It just unlocks a part of the character. And the other thing that, again, is like new for me, you know, especially now going back and looking at all of this, is that I can appreciate how valuable it is in having these Legion characters who they respect him, but they don't worship at the altar of Superman. Some of them do, right? Like Polar Boy. I think that's kind of a running bit where he's so in awe. He's awestruck of Superman, of course. But generally, it's like, these were his peers, his contemporaries. I mean, he was the inspiration for them, but they met him at an earlier point in his journey when he's a kid. And so they all come up together. And I guess it's not entirely dissimilar from the dynamic among the Trinity in the present day of Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, where they're on equal footing, each in their own way. But you don't get a ton of that elsewhere, I feel, necessarily. But when you go to the Legion, right, like, they have that dynamic with him. It's different. There's that great issue, that epilogue issue to Superman and the Legion. Again, I know I'm jumping ahead, but Lightning Lad brings Superman back to the present, and they're in the fortress, and Batman interrupts them. But they're just telling stories about all the shenanigans that they would get up to. And Batman's a little bit like, oh, like, you got into some trouble, you know, back in the day. And Clark's like, yeah, like, I kind of needed to cut loose sometimes. Like the Legion showed me that sometimes, you know, sometimes you had to break the rules, sometimes for fun. And so it's just this whole other side of his character. So again, when we just kind of look at the rich tapestry that is Superman, this is a piece of it. And more and more, I guess what I keep coming back to is that just because something has been a part of the character's history doesn't necessarily mean it always has to be. But I think it's at least worth taking a look at, right? And what I've come away from all of this kind of feeling is that time with the Legion is a critical piece of the puzzle. It doesn't have to be there in every telling, but when it is, there's a lot to mine there. And again, you start to see all of that come into play here. And kind of one of the other, I guess, big moments in terms of Superman talking about his past with the Legion is a little bit deeper into the Lightning Saga, when the teams have realized kind of what's going on with the belt that I believe Wildfire had, right? Where it contained these miniature lightning rods. And so you have this moment where Superman's explaining to them, I think I know why they're here. I think I know what they're doing. There's this ritual that we performed once. And so this is a direct reference to the 1963 story, The Super Sacrifice of the Legionnaires from Adventure Comics 312, where Lightning Lad had died and the team performed this ritual where they each held up these miniature lightning rods and called down the lightning. And the idea was that one of them would be struck and trade their life for the deceased Lightning Lad. And sort of the twist of that story, and Superman explains all of this to the characters in the Lightning Saga, is that Saturn Girl seemingly perished, but then it turned out that Chameleon Boy's shape-shifting pet Prody had taken her place. So Saturn Girl lived, as did Lightning Lad. Of course, they did lose Prody. We would later get a Prody II, who we actually talked about in our Silver Age crypto discussion. So we actually did touch on that. But that's when we kind of get the clearer picture. Like, they're here, these time-displaced Legionnaires are here to perform this ritual and resurrect someone. But this is where you get this great exchange between Batman and Superman, where Batman's like, you were kids, and Superman's like, no, we were Legion. And it's just, man, like moments like that where I just loved.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I read that original story. So right now on the Comic Binge, we actually have a regular series called Long Live the Legion, where Joe Corallo, who's an independent comics artist who's actually gotten some work with DC recently, he comes on with us and he gives us, honestly, a lot of early Adventure Comics issues. Well, I guess not early, but Adventure Comics issues, Superboy and the Legion stories, Jim Shooter, Paul Levitz, like the whole 9 yards. We're actually working our way up to the Great Darkness Saga. And there's such a... Reading those stories now feels... What's the word? Incongruous, I guess. The tone is all over the place. So this is where one of Johns' strengths comes through. And, I include Meltzer in that too, because Meltzer identified some of the same traits, particularly in Identity Crisis. But finding some kind of modern justification or in to some rather baffling older comic book story to tell a particular or to serve a particular narrative purpose. And I think that's what the team is doing here. But it's also just like, what do we know is going to happen? What device can we invoke that we like that could give us a cleaner narrative path to it? Yeah, this counts. Sure. You're talking about a lightning rod. Okay. Maybe a little on the nose, arguably, but who's to argue with the result? I think the result ended up being pretty good. And it's just one of those instances where this goofy comic book plot point that was dreamed up by a teenage Jim Shooter. We got to remember he was a teenager during that time, which is baffling to me. But how can we find a way to place that in our modern story where we have all of these other dramatic considerations and mechanical narrative considerations to make? Pretty solid.
We reference the television series Smallville a lot around here, and there's one Smallville rewatch podcast that's always at the top of my queue. Always Hold On to Smallville, hosted by our pal, Zach Moore. Zach and his guests bring tremendous insight, passion, and humor as they discuss each and every episode of the series that ushered in the renaissance of superhero TV. Listen to Always Hold On to Smallville wherever you get podcasts, and keep an eye out for the other shows under the Always Hold On to banner, including Arrow, DC's Legends of Tomorrow, Superman and Lois, and Star Wars. Filmmakers and movie fans alike should be sure to attend these film festivals: Brightside Tavern in Jersey City, Hang On to Your Shorts in Asbury Park, Point Lookout on Long Island, and Round Reel in Bloomfield, New Jersey. Take it from an alum of 2 of them. Submission information for filmmakers, as well as details about the festivals, can be found at filmfreeway.com. Follow the festivals on social media for news about events, discounts, tickets, and more. Also, listen to the Hang On to Your Shorts and Cullen on Film podcasts available via a shared universe network. Creator and podcaster Perry Constantine, host of Superhero Cinephiles, has a special offer for listeners of this podcast. Visit percivalconstantine.com/DFK or click the link in the show notes. Fill out the form and then get 2 free novels and 1 free superhero short story. The novels are Vanguard, Heroes Forged, an Avengers-inspired team of superheroes, and Ronin Born, a cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic, fascist Japan. The short story is Omega Knights, Fire and Lightning, a Power Rangers-inspired prequel to an upcoming serial. Take advantage of this offer today, and be sure to catch Superhero Cinephiles on all major podcast platforms. I think to the story's strength, there's no editor's note that says, for more on this, see Adventure Comics 312, right? Like, that's not there. And you don't need it. Right, the first time I read this, and even initially upon my reread, I hadn't looked at Adventure Comics 312, right? But you buy into it, and it works on its own in and of itself. And then I was curious enough where I looked up that issue, and I didn't pour through it, but I skimmed through it, and the cover is really cool and really striking. And it shows them with the lightning rods performing the ritual. And yeah, like to your point, it's weird. Like it's this, it's this weird resurrection ritual. It's like, what are you guys doing?
But yeah, that wasn't on my bingo card when I opened this bookshop.
But the idea that they would do that for each other, despite the risk to any one of them, this game of Russian roulette that they're playing here, again, really speaks to that bond that they all share. One of the other things that I like, and I think I was getting at this a little bit last week when we were talking about the Legion animated series. This is another one of those things. It's not the hill I'm going to die on, but I do kind of like the idea of, how do I put this? Like a separation between Superman and the Legion. Like in that Legion animated series, he went there once and he spent an extended period of time with them, and then he went back, and then an older version of him went back later. It wasn't like, oh, he's going back and forth every weekend like we used to see in the pre-crisis comics. And here, something that Superman articulates at multiple points, but especially in the Lightning Saga, in this moment, I think when he's talking to the two teams, he's like, I used to have these adventures with them, and then the crisis hit. I never saw them again. And there is this separation. There's a sense of loss. There's something, I kind of gravitate towards this idea of it being this, again, kind of like a discrete period of time. And then this kind of the sense of separation or loss, like there's a lack of access to them. There's something about that I find kind of compelling. I don't know how you feel about that.
I feel similarly about it, just because, it is like this sense of belonging. It's an idea that was, they attempted to copy it for Spider-Man, and it didn't work out nearly as well there, unfortunately. But I mean, I like it because it's not necessarily that the Legion was taken from Superman in a way that he knows, but having the chance as a creator to comment on these different developments that Superman has gone through. We saw this, magnified 20 times in Doomsday Clock, particularly by the end of it. But here, it's a way to sort of let longtime and new readers in on the idea of this is a character who is constantly evolving. And, here's something that we lost before that I think I want to put back in. And, how does this make you feel? That's kind of how I feel about it. It does a really good job of referring to these changes that Superman has gone through without the character necessarily being aware himself of what is missing in his life. And I think depending on the reader, it could evoke a wide variety of different emotions. And, but at the end of the day, in terms of the service that it gives to the character, there's a lot there. And it again adds to a sense of pathos that some people don't even think, frankly, that Superman is capable of having.
And when you say it's open to the reader, I like that, because I was thinking about this, like why he never saw them again in a real world or meta context. Yeah, we had Crisis on Infinite Earths and continuity was changed. But then when you get to Superman and the Legion, you get this accounting of why they never went back to get him because of Earthman and the Justice League and all of that, which we'll get into. So it's kind of accounted for in a couple of different ways, I guess, depending on how you look at it. I mentioned again this team of displaced Legionnaires who are here on this mystery mission. The other thing that I guess was interesting, and they talk about this in the book, is how they're all kind of trapped in their worst nightmare in some way, shape, or form, right? Like Karate Kid, whose superpower, so to speak, is his martial arts ability, is forced to rely on a weapon as Trident when he's sort of under this spell, so to speak. Dream Girl is locked up in Arkham Asylum and is being used by Dr. Destiny to bring the other Arkham inmates' nightmares to life. And of course, what are they all afraid of? Batman. You get this great sequence where you see all these monstrous versions. Wildfire, again, forced to be this immobile statue in the fortress. Timberwolf, the ultimate loner, is racing as part of the pack in Gorilla City. Dawnstar, again, had been spending time on Thanagar. By the time the team gets there, she's already made her way to Earth. And then we had mentioned Starman, of course, unable to think clearly due to the limitations of 21st century psychiatric care and medicine. And then the final one, who is the final reveal, right, is Censor Girl, who pops up at the old Secret Society headquarters, essentially the Legion of Doom headquarters from the Super Friends. And you also get, in addition to Superman's fond memories of his time with the Legion and the little glimpses that we get into that, we do also get his frustration with them. And at one point in the climax of the story, I think it's Censor Girl he's talking to. He's like, I'm annoyed. Like, what's the matter with you people? Like, what are you doing? Because once they all, again, it's sort of a two-step, part to them waking up, right? Because there's this mental block that's been placed there, and the Interlac verbal code kind of breaks that down. But then they're also still just confused. There's this disorientation caused by time travel. And Superman talks about that to the two teams early on. And that's actually when we get our first glimpse or mention of the Legion of Three Worlds. He's like, there's this adventure that no one can really remember. It's undocumented because no one really remembers the details. It's called Legion of Three Worlds. So again, man, Johns knew where he was going with this.
He had roadmaps for roadmaps, it seems. And I think that applies to pretty much every major title that he was a part of during this time. Green Lantern and Action Comics were by far the most prominent ones, of course, but he also had a lot of say in where the wider Green Lantern line went. Obviously, at some point later than this, the Green Lantern and larger DCU threads converge in a pretty big way, and that's also something that's referenced later in this trilogy. But that was part of the fun of going on this journey. Like, he's a creator who has always understood the strength of continuity as a means to tell stories that you can't really tell in other mediums, at least not to this degree of effectiveness. If you're in the demographic of someone who is reading these books on a regular basis, you're weaving between things regularly, seeing this one creator sort of converge these things together is a really rewarding experience. But then on top of that, again, you see the human element of Superman come to the fore, and this kind of stimulation that I don't think anyone else can stir in him, in terms of the feelings of fondness for what they did as kids, or the annoying frustration that he exhibits as well. We don't see Superman make these kinds of swings, but it's the Legion that can push him there. And I think that does a good job of potentially implanting in a reader's mind that this is a very special relationship. Even if you made it, like, he's been talking about why it's a special relationship, but if you didn't get the idea of how personal it was to him before, seeing him go through this emotional journey with different members of the team should communicate that pretty effectively, particularly as kind of a setup for what we're about to get in Action Comics.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another reason why I think that having that separation there is important, because he hasn't seen them in a while. And so, look, as comic book readers, they're the Legion, we know it'll probably work out all right. But it at least creates the idea, the possibility that, yeah, maybe things have changed. Maybe there is some sort of sinister purpose here afoot. You don't know for sure.
Right.
But then at the same time, it is such a singular dynamic that you don't really have him experience with anyone else, where they are these childhood friends. And we all have those childhood friends where it's like, there's that shorthand that always exists, and kind of that benefit of the doubt that maybe you'll always afford, someone based on those past experiences, no matter how much time has passed. And so again, it's very specific in terms of what this can tap into for the character. But again, eventually the Legion, they sort of come to their senses and remember what they're there to do. And they give the teams the slip, and they get into place. They each have their location to go to. And what members of the League and Society, specifically, I think Bruce and Hal, start to clock is that the Legionnaires are placing themselves in locations that are significant to the Flash. Barry Allen in particular, that seems to be what Bruce and Hal are really zeroing in on. So it's Barry's old lab, and the place where he showed up when he was materializing in Crisis on Infinite Earths. But then there's also Blue Valley, Nebraska, and Titan's Tower. So it's not strictly limited to Barry, but for some of the characters and for us as the reader, we don't know yet. And the idea of who they're there to resurrect we are definitely in Flash territory, but whether it's going to be Barry, Wally, we don't know exactly where this is going. And ultimately, the lightning strikes. Karate Kid is the one who's holding the rod that gets struck. He lives though, and later his explanation is I ducked, which I I don't know. Not to nitpick this. How did you feel about Karate Kid surviving the lightning strike?
I was okay with it just because I didn't want to see anybody die, particularly during this time, as I was really just getting to know these characters on a deeper level. I liked Karate Kid. There's something about introducing him, I guess, to me as someone who was led primarily in the bat-shaped line of thinking. Having him introduced as a better fighter than Batman is a really solid first impression for all intents and purposes, for a deeper understanding of who he is. But I mean, I think I was ultimately just okay with it, even though things take a turn in a later issue for him specifically.
Yes, he doesn't make it out of this trilogy, but not that I wanted to see someone die, or see him die in particular. I wouldn't have minded some kind of twist a la that original story where, it was the shape-shifting pet who took the place. But the idea of like, he just survived, I'm like, all right, like that felt like if we're going to play this Russian roulette resurrection game, I don't know, man, you got to kind of stick to the rules, I feel.
Yeah, and I think that's totally fair. I would not challenge you, especially in terms of the mechanics of how it's supposed to work. It kind of breaks it, you could argue. But, I smiled. So I guess I let it slide, even though there are other things that are maybe less severe that I have not let slide in comics reading in the past.
Fair enough. Now, the lightning strikes, the smoke clears, and it's not Barry, it's Wally West and Linda and their two twins who are now older. And we last saw all of them, as you were mentioning earlier, in Infinite Crisis when they were fighting Superboy Prime, and Wally was being pulled into the Speed Force, and he called to his family, and they all stuck together. And now here they are in this smoking crater. And I can't tell you why, man, but there's something about this moment when Wally speaks. All of those Wally issues for years, they always open with, "My name is Wally West. I'm the fastest man alive." And he can't get it out. He's like, I'm faster than anyone. And I don't know what it is about that, but I get chills like every time I read that and I think about it.
It was such a great moment. And it was especially great because, so it's great on a couple of different levels. First of all, JOHNS for years, and we're talking about a Meltzer issue, but JOHNS for years by this point has created this tinge of, by this time, subtle antagonism, but before it was a huge, like, outward sense of antagonism between Batman and Hal Jordan. However, what we find out later when Barry starts to come back into the fold more is that Barry was capable of being friends with both of them for very different reasons. He was sort of the conduit that connected Batman and Green Lantern. And Mark Waid did a pretty good job with that dynamic in his issues of The Brave and the Bold with George Pérez. But it was a really interesting one. And even by this time, it seemed like they were starting to push the Barry button even more. They teased Barry up to and in Infinite Crisis as potentially coming back. I was totally convinced while I was reading this that it was going to be Barry that was coming back. So when it was Wally who appeared, I wasn't disappointed, but I was just like, oh, well, they're going in a wholly different direction. And what are they going to end up doing with Wally? Because this was setting up, Mark Waid was jumping back on the Flash ongoing at this point. It's not as a particularly well-regarded run compared to his first time with the character, but that was still exciting for the time. People were pleased to have Wally back. A whole generation of people only see him as the Flash, something I think we've talked about before. But that just led to another sense of mystery by the time we got to the very, very end of the Lightning Saga. Something that they must have had clear eyes for, because something else that we learn, I don't think we learn it here, but we learn it in subsequent stories, is that the death of Bart Allen occurs at the same moment that Wally is brought back.
Yes,
So,
there's a special. It's the All Flash special that
right,
Waid wrote
yes.
that then led into the resuming of the Flash series that had run pre Infinite Crisis. Like the numbering picked up right where it left off, skipping over that year-long Bart Allen series that you were mentioning earlier. And yeah, in that All Flash special, it picks up right after Lightning Saga, where Wally's back, and then he gets the word about Bart's death, the adult Bart's death at the hands of the Rogues, and he goes after Inertia, the one who had initiated all of this. And yeah, that's when you get this sense that, okay, these were happening simultaneously, Wally's return and Bart's death. And I know I'm jumping ahead, but again, we can look at kind of the broad scope of this trilogy. What you ultimately, well, you get to the end of the Lightning Saga, and you have most of the Legionnaires who have returned to the future, and they've given one of the lightning rods to Brainiac, and he's like, oh, it brought back West? That's curious. Right? They were there to capture someone else. And you see just kind of like the hint of a face in that lightning rod that Brainiac 5 is holding at the end of that. And what ultimately we'll find out in Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds is their mission was to get Bart Allen, was like to capture his essence at the moment of his death, essentially, and then reconstitute him there in the future. And we see that play out in Legion of Three Worlds. But of course, again, as you're reading Lightning Saga, I agree with you. I think as you're reading it, certainly is leading you towards thinking, oh, it's Barry. And then you're like, oh, it's Wally. And again, for me, I'm like, yes, thank you. I missed this guy. And then there's still this ongoing mystery of like, okay, who were they actually there for? Was it Barry? Was it someone else? I mean, I'll be honest, man, I don't think it's been so many years, I can't remember, but I don't think I thought Bart at the time. Like, I don't know that that's something that would have even really crossed my mind, to be honest.
No, in fact, I think that was thinking about him was actively discouraged because he was dying. I can't remember exactly where the timelines line up on Flash Fastest Man Alive 13, where he is actually killed by the Rogues, and this issue. I don't think that they coincide, but I think Bart was actually dead by this point. So, I mean, that implies that they're kind of discarding him, at least for now. Why would you think that he's going to end up serving as this bigger moment in this story later on, particularly because by this point, we didn't have the full picture yet, and the Flash seemed like a rather tangential inclusion in this whole story, and it only really comes together at the very end. So, yeah, I mean, I certainly wasn't thinking about Bart, and I think it was because the predominant wisdom of the time would seem to indicate that DC doesn't really want to explore Bart at the moment. Little did we know.
Little did we know. You brought up a great point, though, about Barry, right? And maintaining these friendships with Bruce and with Hal. They're so different, but he has these friendships. That's echoed in that Superman and the Legion of Superheroes epilogue issue, Action 864, where, again, we have Lightning Lad and Superman in the fortress, and Batman's there. And we find out in that story, and so this kind of ties in here. So at the end of Lightning Saga, most of the Legionnaires go back to the future. Starman, of course, stays in this time, and he'll continue to play a role in Justice Society and the Thy Kingdom Come storyline. The whole idea, right, with that Starman, and we've actually talked about this in a previous episode long ago, but that as he was traveling back in time, he ended up on Earth 22, the Earth of Kingdom Come. Right. So again, he still has a role to play in that story. And Karate Kid stays behind because he still has a mission to fulfill. And he's also joined by one of Triplicate Girl's selves. And so at the end of Lightning Saga, like, they run off. Unfortunately, they end up getting murdered. And we see that in that Action 864 issue. But that issue is narrated by, as we come to find out, the Time Trapper. But there's this discussion about how Superman, similar to Barry, right, has this friendship with Lightning Lad and with Bruce. And they're so different, right? And just kind of noting the dynamics that are at play here. So as you were saying that, it kind of made me think of what we would see articulated a little bit later on. But, that's the Lightning Saga, right? So it's this reintroduction of the pre-crisis version of the team. It's not the post-crisis, the post-Zero Hour reboot. It's not the Mark Waid threeboot. It's the original pre-crisis version of the team. Clark has history with them. We get some glimpses into that. He talks about it. They are here on this mystery mission. They give him the runaround. They don't clue him in. He's frustrated. He's annoyed. Wally's back, which is a joyous occasion. And then these Legionnaires disappear. And then that leads us into the next act in this trilogy here, which is this Superman and the Legion of Superheroes 6-part storyline by JOHNS and Frank in the pages of Action Comics, where now you get this explanation as to what's been going on in the future, where there's this Brainiac robot that's attacking in Metropolis, but it's actually Brainiac 5 who's controlling it and delivering this message to Superman. The robot delivers this, they call it a memory charge, and Clark is kind of flooded with all of these memories of his younger days in Smallville, and we see kind of glimpses of the young Clark Kent in Smallville that we'll see expanded upon in Secret Origin. This is really, really getting in the weeds here, but he already remembered those things, right? Like, it was just that the memory charge brought them to the surface, but was your reading that he had actually forgotten them for some reason? Or not?
That was my reading, but I didn't think it was correct. I remember thinking, well, wait a second, he already knew about this. But if I had to chalk it up to anything, I think it's just Johns knew that this was going to bring new people into the Legion fold. He needed a quick way to provide sufficient exposition to establish what Clark's relationship was with them when he was a kid. I think if I had to justify it, if I had to think of a way that all of this works together, it might just be that, it wasn't necessarily Brainy's intention to bring that flood of memories to Superman as much as it was just like a byproduct of the actual effect of what he was doing and trying to communicate with him. But that's kind of a tenuous justification at best. Ultimately, I think the purpose was expository more than anything.
I agree. And my read on it is because, again, to make this line up with what we saw in Lightning Saga, I look at it as the memory charge, again, like it flooded him with these memories, but they were memories that he had, that he was able to access. It wasn't like he had forgotten them. I think that's the way it plays when you read it. But yeah, I don't think that's actually the case. But of course, Superman agrees to help and he goes to the future. And this is now where we get a glimpse into what the 31st century has become, where it is led by Earthman and his Justice League. And as we find out over the course of the story, there's been this disinformation campaign to make the people think that Superman was actually born on Earth and was not an alien, but rather fought against aliens. And it creates this humans first movement. And aliens on the planet are either rounded up and imprisoned or deported or flee for their safety. The Legion is run underground. They're all split up. Some have been imprisoned. Others are working as kind of these underground freedom fighters. The sun has been turned red. Initially, the idea is that there was a space shuttle accident, but then we later find out that Sunboy has been taken and imprisoned, and they've been using his powers to change the sun from yellow to red. So for the majority of the story, Superman doesn't have his powers here. He only has the Legion flight ring to rely on. So that's the setup for all of this. And of course, it culminates in this confrontation with Earthman, with some moments here that I think are some of just the most undeniably iconic Superman moments. And I mentioned one a few minutes ago about, I've been an outsider every day of my life. There's also another one. I want to give you the honors. You probably know what I'm talking about here. When one of the soldiers is like, "Oh, Superman's here. He's for us. He's for humans.
I'm for everyone." The line that he says as he, for the first time, he's able to blocks a shot from a gun with his bare hand. And the bandage that had adorned his hand from being injured by trying to do that same thing early on in the story is taken off with the shot against his bare hand. No, this moment encapsulates everything that you want a Superman story to be about, really. I mean, you could make a case, or I think a rather convincing case, that Superman and the Legion of Superheroes as a story unto itself is more timely now than when it first came out. On top of that, you have a depiction of Superman who is everything that we want him to be, even when he is potentially at his lowest. Again, I really do feel like Johns was consciously trying to undercut these constant criticisms of the Superman character that are levied at him all the time. He's nothing without his powers. There's another common refrain that would come out of the mouths of Superman doubters or haters during that time, and probably now too. And this is a story about how he manages without his defining traits in the minds of many people. But all of that to sort of culminate in this moment at the end of the story to give service to the idea of strength in difference and in his understanding and owning of his own heritage as someone not from Earth, particularly when he sees people who are being subjugated for being different. That's when that old golden age title of champion of the oppressed emerges again. And as classic as that is, it also feels modern and just everything that you want from the beacon of this universe that we all love. He is the one who's front and center, who's in the lead, who's the poster boy, who is the example for every other hero there. And Johns manages, and Frank, let's not beat around the bush when it comes to the strength of Gary Frank's visuals here, but these creators managed to provide a singularly definitive moment that will communicate to anybody previously unfamiliar with Superman who he is, what he's all about when he is both at his worst and at his best. I absolutely love this story. That moment is no small contributor to that ongoing love for it.
Beautifully said. I mean, that moment is such a standout. And honestly, I would say this is my favorite of the trilogy. And I think it's the one that, it is the one that stands on its own the most. Right? I mean, Legion of Three Worlds is a lot of fun, but there's a lot going on there and a lot of characters who are thrown at you.
It's very intense, especially in the middle of it. Absolutely.
And that's appealing in its own way. But, and for us, we've been reading and studying this stuff. So I think it works for us, but especially for a newer or more casual reader, Superman and the Legion of Superheroes really gives you this complete story about Superman helping his friends, returning to this world where he had spent a formative part of his youth, and finding that his symbol, his name, his legacy, his inspiration has been perverted into something that's the exact opposite of what he stands for. And he and his friends need to band together to take it back. As everybody knows, right, the death and return of Superman is everything for me. And it made me think of, in looking at Earthman and his Justice League, and they wear armbands with the Superman symbol. And school children are taught about how Superman was born on Earth. And even just kind of subverting the legend and the familiar imagery that we're so used to, the story opens with an alien couple sending their child to Earth to save him. And he's found by this seemingly kindly couple who, upon recognizing him as an alien, shoot him, right? So right from the jump, we're like, oh, we're in very different territory here. But it reminds me of the climax of Reign of the Supermen, when Superman has his final confrontation with Hank Henshaw after the kryptonite blast and the smoke is covering the panels, and Superman emerges and he's like, "You murdered millions, Henshaw, and you did it wearing my symbol, using my name," right? And it's not hubris, it's not ego, but it's this idea of like, this symbol means something. Like, I've built it to mean something to people, and you have taken it and turned it into something it's not. So all of that just rang so true. And you were getting at this, and it was certainly something I was thinking about as I was reading it. And generally speaking, I don't get political on the show because we're here to have a good time and talk about Superman and have a break from everything that's going on. So I'll keep this quick and I'll tread lightly, and I'll only speak for myself. But, people can debate policy, right, in our society, and that's all well and good, and that's part of the process. One of the things that has been infuriating as a citizen of this country over the past few years is a particular contingent willfully, gleefully denying objectively verifiable facts. Absolutely infuriating. And so as I read this, now more than ever, it rings so true. It feels so timely, like you said, where it's like, oh yeah, I could 1000% buy how the populace could come to believe this fiction about someone. And especially here, when you're talking about 1,000 years later. So you have that added onto it. I could believe we have people here now who don't believe things that, again, are objectively verifiable. So, I had that in my head, and it was, again, it just made the story even more resonant than it was before, because we are literally living through similar types of things as we speak.
At their best, these kinds of stories are tales about ourselves, different facets of ourselves. You know, I think it's safe to say I want stories that do have something to say. And if you're going to try and establish some kind of real world relevance to a story that you're telling, then you naturally have to get to issues of the time that float up against politics. I mean, I studied politics in school for 4 years. I am convinced that there is a political element to virtually every kind of life, at varying degrees of severity, but politics plays a far larger role in things, even before the explosion of this insane polarization that we are experiencing right now. It's always been there. And I think having consciousness in storytelling requires a degree of political commentary, particularly when you're dealing with these larger than life icons, you know, something that Star Trek does all the time, something that Superman does all the time. And I mean, you can't necessarily realistically portray a character with overriding moral authority unless he takes some positions on things, you know? And I mean, ideally positions that you would have to extrapolate a lot to get to some semblance of a political ideology, but you need to be able to take a stand in order to demonstrate what moral authority looks like. And I think JOHNS as a writer recognizes that, and DC broadly has recognized it for a long time. I think we're seeing shades of it now, but you know, and it might also get a little uncomfortable from time to time, but if these stories want to have a chance of moving people, then I kind of think it's important to at least try to go there if you think you can do it in an artful way. And I think this story qualifies, certainly.
It does. And that message of I'm for everyone. I mean, if you're going to plant a flag anywhere when it comes to the character of Superman, it's that he's for everyone. He stands up to the bully, you know, no matter who they're targeting. Yeah, this was such a strong story. There were a few things that really jumped out at me. One was Superman's humility. There's a scene where he's sort of getting the lay of the land from the Legionnaires, who's underground with, and he has some line about how he's like, I know I helped inspire the Legion, but, you know, essentially like, I'm not that big of a deal is kind of the spirit of it. And I think it's Dawnstar who's like, no, it's like your ideals form the foundation of the United Planets and this entire alliance and everything that we're about. So just that humility. There's also a moment where the Legionnaires, they've made it to the Justice League of Earth, their base, and they found Sunboy, who's strung up and being used to change the sun. And it's probably Brainiac or one of the others who says, like, oh, we got to get him down. Like, then you'll have your powers back. But Superman's first response is like, no, Sunboy looks like he's in pain. Like, that's what Superman is worried about. Like, his friend, his teammate is suffering. That's the primary objective. It's not, oh, I got to get my powers back. So much so that he takes the fight to Earthman. Again, he has his ring at least, but he's like, let's take this outside. Maybe shades of, would you care to step outside, General? It doesn't get that explicit, but maybe shades of that. But, you know, he forces the fight outside while he only has the ring, and Earthman gets the better of him, and Superman is plummeting, right? Like Earthman destroys his ring, and Superman's just falling, and that's it. Thankfully, they're able to get Sunboy out in time, and the sun changes back to yellow. And of course, Superman is able to stop himself. And that's when we have that great confrontation. And then I guess the final thing that I really loved about the story is the juxtaposition between Polar Boy and Earthman, right? Because both of them were people who tried out to be in the Legion of Superheroes and didn't make it. And what did Polar Boy do? Well, he became part of the Legion of Substitute Heroes, and he built himself up, and he earned his spot. He did what you're supposed to do. Whereas Earthman just went in the opposite direction and took this alternate path of, again, this campaign against everything that Superman has stood for, and banded together with these other rejects who couldn't handle not making the cut. And all of these stories, meant more to me now because of watching that Legion of Superheroes animated series that we talked about last week. And I know you and I were talking off mic. I know you haven't experienced that show yet. I highly recommend it, especially for me. Like, I don't have this wealth of, I've read all these Legion comics, right? So I now, though, have 26 episodes of a really great animated show that gave me those core personalities and interpersonal dynamics among the team where I'm like, okay, it's not always a 100% match, but it's pretty close. And so as I'm reading these stories, I'm like, okay, like I can sink my teeth into this more now than I ever could before. And it just gave me so much more affinity. I was more invested in the Legion side of things than I was before. So that show, I really can't recommend it enough. But yeah, just to kind of see Polar Boy and Earthman, how they went in these opposite directions and, how it paid off for each of them.
Yeah, Earthman is a really interesting character here. And I think that they do some pretty fascinating things with him later, not necessarily even with Johns' involvement. Like he ended up showing up, I think, in the Legion ongoing that Paul Levitz wrote, I think starting in, was that 2010?
Yeah, there was, there was that. You're right. And I'm glad you brought that up because, one of the things we've talked about is like, well, they haven't done much with Superboy, Clark as Superboy in this time period. And really they didn't. But yes, you did have that solo Legion ongoing series that ran, I think, for like a year-ish before we hit the New 52.
Right. Yeah. And Legion was actually part of the New 52, which I thought was really interesting. I would have been more surprising to see the JSA, but of course we know what the New 52 did with them. But no, it's just, there are so many different facets of this story that could be commented on. Earthman as a character, I said he's interesting, and the idea, the theme of a symbol's subversion or perversion, arguably could also be seen as bitingly relevant today, depending on where you might stand on things. But I think everybody can at least relate to the idea of feeling like something that you care about a lot is wholly misrepresented, in some form or fashion. And the tension that creates over the course of this story. Granted, it also lends itself to a degree of a fantastical element, because redefining symbols is not an easy thing to do. It takes something drastic to redefine the symbolic power that a certain image creates in people. So to think that it's possible for Superman to be able to reclaim this to such a definitive degree, that might be an element of fantasy. However, the value of that fantasy is by showing the power of truth. And I mean, if there's one idea that is central to an identifiable ideology that Superman has, it is his dedication to truth. If you wanted to get even more reductive, you could probably argue that Superman's ideology is just to reduce harm however I can. The only thing is that as the most powerful being in the universe, whatever he can is a hell of a lot. So he has the power to reduce harm on magnitudes we can barely comprehend. And that's what makes him so interesting, the fact that he manages to maintain that outlook on things despite these challenges that modern stories throw at him. And I think it was exemplified really well here. And particularly the perversion of the symbol, I think, really lends itself to that, even if you might have to suspend your disbelief a little bit.
Yeah, and in fairness, I mean, as far as, how Superman's able to turn the tide, I mean, I think, yes, he certainly, the display he puts on in front of those people there in that moment, clearly he's changed hearts and minds. But to Johns' credit, like when we get to Legion of Three Worlds, we revisit 31st century Earth in major political upheaval as the United Planets is in disarray. There's discussion of Earth seceding. The Legion's role is very much up in the air. So you see that despite what Superman was able to accomplish, there's still so much work to be done. And kind of on the note of like how this perversion was even able to take place, there's, we don't necessarily, we see kind of what's been set up, right? We don't necessarily see the inception of it, but it is all this propaganda campaign. But you find out that Earthman allegedly found this ancient tablet in the Arctic, I believe, and that prove that Superman was born on Earth. And by the time we get to Legion of Three Worlds, we find out that it was the Time Trapper who had placed it there, and this was all part of the larger plan to, again, corrupt or subvert everything that Superman stands for. But in terms of like, well, how could the people believe all of this? Again, I think us living through current events, like we don't really need much explanation. I think we can see it. But, there's that tablet and then just this propaganda machine. And I'm sure it wasn't that hard of a sell, right, to convince at least certain people on Earth that the reason why they're not where they want to be is because of the aliens that the Earth has taken in, right? We see that today in all of these discussions about immigration. So, I think in terms of how they got to this point, we can definitely fill in those blanks, sadly, pretty easily. Like you said, I know there's so much more we could probably talk about with Superman and the Legion. I feel like we've hit on the most salient points and certainly the most relevant plot points, especially with respect to Superman. Are you cool segueing to Legion of Three Worlds, or is there anything else you want to say about Superman and the Legion?
If I don't stop, I never will. So let's keep the train moving, so to speak.
So, like I said, there's that bridge issue of action right after Superman and the Legion. And I think that's most notable because it introduces or reintroduces the Time Trapper, this classic Legion villain, as this puppet master behind the scenes. And of course, he'll play a large role in Legion of Three Worlds. We will find out more, I guess, about the name. I think it's less about who's under the hood at that point in time. It's an older version of Superboy Prime, spoiler alert. But I think more interesting, this larger idea about not even who, but what the Time Trapper is. Anyway, we'll get to that. But that issue reintroduces the Time Trapper as this puppet master, this villain behind the scenes. But it also, I think what was most interesting to me was what I was getting at earlier, where Bruce is like, we've met 3 different legions. Like, what is going on here? And there's the reference again to Final Night, and there's reference to The Brave and the Bold, the Mark Waid written series. So I guess it's interesting because it's our characters, right, commenting on what we have observed, right, as readers. Like, oh, we've had all these different versions of the Legion. And I mean, up until this point, and especially in this era post-Infinite Crisis, I mean, I think that was kind of surprising, right? Like that the characters were aware that there had been multiple versions. So that's I think what stood out to me about that one the most.
Yeah, I mean, after 20 years of being conditioned to think that no one remembers Crisis on Infinite Earths, why would you assume that the characters in one version of the universe or indigenous to a specific universe would be aware of counterparts elsewhere? I mean, it's a surprising point. But I mean, I wonder who went into this being like really excited that they were going to be able to see their favorite post-Zero Hour Legion again. I wonder how many of those people were there, because this must have been a pretty singular thrill. But also, too, the Superman Museum at the beginning of the first issue is one of my favorite parts in this whole book. We've talked a little bit about Superboy Prime in the past, and we've talked about our affinity for him. This, again, is a continuation of several different threads that JOHNS had been playing with for years. After Infinite Crisis, of course, Superboy Prime was imprisoned by the Green Lantern Corps before he was broken out and inducted into the Sinestro Corps War. On the side of Sinestro, full-scale battles between the Green Lantern Corps, the Justice League, and the forces of the Sinestro Corps, including Superboy Prime. Some additional development in his relationship to the Superman family in that Superman Prime one-shot during the Sinestro Corps War, which was awesome. Robin getting to sit Crypto on Superboy Prime was definitely a personal favorite. But just as I think the importance of this book to the ongoing narrative of the DC universe was not as communicated as it could have been by the publisher. Because there are a lot of things here that pick up on a lot of different threads that a lot of people have been reading, and they kind of shunt this story into a Final Crisis crossover. It's a curious decision because to me it feels bigger than that, but I'm surprised they felt they needed to attach it to the event to get it to sell, considering it's Geoff Johns and George Pérez.
Dude, that's the thing. And that's what I'm glad you brought that up, because that was one of the big things that I wanted to ask you about. It's funny, before I saw the light about Final Crisis, for years, I kind of, I was always like, oh, Final Crisis, Legion of Three Worlds, like that should have just been Final Crisis. But now, of course, I love the core Final Crisis story, but now I come at it from the other way where it's like, yeah, why would you swallow up this Legion of Three Worlds story and slap Final Crisis title and banner on it, where it's really its own thing? I mean, in the pages of Legion of Three Worlds itself, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like there's nothing that even ties into Final Crisis. In Final Crisis itself, in one of the final issues, you see Superman leaving the 31st century and Brainiac equips him with the Miracle Machine, which of course will play a key role in the finale of Final Crisis. But Legion of Three Worlds in and of itself, and I agree with you, it's just like, what? Like, why? It's so odd. It's really baffling to me. Like, why not let this be its own thing? To be perfectly honest, even calling it Legion of Three Worlds might be a bit limiting because it touches on so much more than just the Legion. It's funny though, because one of the criticisms I've heard about it is like, oh, it's more of a Titan story. I don't really agree with that. I mean, obviously the return of Bart and Connor, that's key, but I do still see it primarily as a Legion story. I mean, essentially, you're getting at Superboy Prime. He is pulled into the 31st century, as we find out by the Time Trapper, who in this story is an older version of Superboy Prime. And Superboy Prime gets his lay of the land at the Superboy Museum, courtesy of a Jimmy Olsen hologram, which is very funny. And there's a point where he's like, "Shut your hole, Olsen," which just made me laugh. But long story short, Superboy Prime assembles the Legion of supervillains, and he frees them from the prison planet. I always blank on the name. Takron Galtos, something like that.
Takron Galtos, yeah.
But so he frees
all. Pretty good.
Thank you. So he frees all of the inhabitants. So it's the Legion of supervillains with the Fatal Five and Mordru. They're all working together under the leadership of Superboy Prime, and the Legion, and specifically led by Brainiac 5, the response or the strategy here is to pull in the legions of two other worlds. So the post-Zero Hour reboot Legion, we find out they were from Earth 247 in a nice homage to the issue of Adventure Comics that initially introduced the Legion. And the Mark Waid, Barry Kitson reboot, or threeboot Legion. Man, this is like shades of when you were here for death metal. I'm like, right, although this is honestly, this is easy compared to all that.
Yeah, that was 400. We're at to 250 maybe. Yeah.
And people don't know, due to the time difference, it's literally 1 a.m. on the East Coast where I am as we're recording this, but we're making it. But and so the other one is this threeboot Legion, who we come to find out they're from Earth Prime. They're from Superboy Prime's Earth, right? And that plays into the finale here. But so again, that's Brainiac's strategy: bring in reinforcements, these other two legions, as well as enact his plans to resurrect Bart Allen. And of course, those plans were already in place. We saw that in the Lightning Saga and the return of Connor Kent Superboy. And we'll talk about how that comes into play. But that's the main thrust of Legion of Three Worlds is really we have four legions at play, the supervillains, and then these three different iterations of the story. It's weird. It's dense in terms of the number of characters. And of course, George Pérez, absolutely the perfect person to bring this to life. But it's, and I don't say this as a negative in any way. It's ultimately a pretty simple, like it's not a particularly convoluted story here. How did you feel?
No, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's deliberately designed that way because it's the blow off, right? And having something that's a little more straightforward, considering what the prior two stories had done, particularly the second story. I think it makes a lot of sense. It's the return of the Jedi of the three, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if anything, I do think there's a lot of really well done character development, and those relationships, those interplayed sort of ideas between different characters are explored to a greater degree here. You get even glimpses of Superman's past that would be further cemented in Secret Origin. And as people, again, curious at this time about what form the origin was taking, that was really fascinating to take a look at. But, and it's George Pérez, the fact that he is involved with this. It could have, I really do believe this could have been an event on its own. And I kind of feel like the tie to Final Crisis is preventing its further publication today because they're trying to figure out how to brand it. And it might be legitimately confusing to people who are picking up Final Crisis now and seeing this other story that was a tie-in, 16 years ago, that is no longer really a tie-in to it to any meaningful degree.
Given where we started, though, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but like, given where we started about the Geoff Johns Legion trilogy, like, that's how you do it. Like, maybe that's how.
No, you're right.
Like, you fully rebrand this. I don't disagree. I mean, I would love to get more of a sense of. I'll reach out to DC. Say,
there you go.
What was this about? No, I agree, and maybe that does, because you and I were talking about this off mic, because I know you recently picked up and you showed me the gorgeous Absolute Superman edition by Geoff Johns and Gary Frank. That of course includes Superman and the Legion and Secret Origin. But we were talking about how Superman and the Legion of Superheroes and Final Crisis Legion of Three Worlds, as we speak currently, are not in print, which is insane to me. Individually, again, now you can get Superman, the Legion, and the Absolute, but like, it's insane to me that those single volumes are not available. So maybe a rebranding is in order.
I think it would be, and I mean, if they didn't already publish one of these stories in an Absolute already, that could have been an interesting Absolute edition, was those three stories together. But it really does deserve, I think, a bigger canvas than it is getting now, and in a literal sense to a degree, because Pérez's artwork in an oversized format is wondrous. I've got a couple deluxe edition hardcovers of New Teen Titans, for instance. I've got the Absolute edition of Crisis on Infinite Earths. Seeing his work magnified to those formats, it does it a lot of favors. I have the standard edition hardcover they released of Legion of Three Worlds at the time that it had just come out a few months afterward. But that's, as a standard size hardcover, it's not the biggest canvas that his work deserves to be seen on. And I think recognizing that, as well as recognizing just how many different stories this one culminates from Johns's bibliography, this is unfortunately a potential blind spot for a lot of people who need access to collected editions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's a question that I don't know that either of us can really answer, given what we laid out about our history with the Legion. To your earlier point, I would imagine that someone who has any affinity for the retroboot, the reboot, or the threeboot version of the Legion would be happy that all three are accounted for. I mean, I think that's a beautiful thing, because anytime you have a crisis and you have any sort of continuity rewriting it, you can easily just discard something. But Johns didn't do that, right? Instead, he's like, no, all three of these legions have existed, do exist. They have their space in the multiverse, and they're going to come together in this story. And I think there's something very commendable about that. And I think that enriches this story, and it does a great service to the fans and the creators, right, who were involved in those other versions. The question that I don't know that either of us can answer is, like, I'm sure it was thrilling to see all of them come together. If you were a diehard fan of any of them, especially the reboot and threeboot, did you get enough? Right? Like, they're there and there are these big scenes, and especially the Brainiacs, you get the bickering among the three of them, which is fun. And especially the threeboot version of the Legion, they're very anti-adult. So there's that undercurrent, more than an undercurrent in those interactions there. And then you sort of get the reboot Brainiacs, because it's a little bit of a mediator, I suppose. But I wonder if there's enough for like the real fans of either of those versions. If
I can see it from two different perspectives. On the one hand, sure, the fact that they're in a book at all is probably a pretty exciting prospect to fans of those other versions of the characters. I don't know if it necessarily checks a lot of boxes for classic Legion fans, just because, those characters are back, but they're also not a major focus. You could argue that the spotlight is taken off of the Legion, arguably, and put onto characters like Superman, Superboy Prime, Bart Allen, Connor Kent. these characters that have a tangential tie to the Legion, but are not, as embedded as a solo Legion book, so to speak, would be. So that's, I guess, the other perspective I see it from. Well, they're not really major players. These are glorified cameos. So why should I get excited about it? On the other hand, you're seeing them again for the first time in a long time. I think it affects more older fans like that had started reading in the 90s. Classic Legion fans might also think that the Legion doesn't have as prominent a place as it should.
Maybe. Fair. No, you know what? Honestly, I know that's probably, well, I don't know. Circling back to this idea, just like with reinstating Clark as Superboy, but operating in secret. It's like, we want to have a balance, but it's like, are we fully serving anyone? I don't know. Oh, you and I enjoyed this story a lot.
Yeah.
And I do agree. I think this is very much like, I know there will be people listening to this who know and love this story. And they're like, talk about this, talk about that. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people though, who have never read it. Perhaps due to lack of availability or just, again, I think we're right in terms of this branding of it. I think it really gets lost in the shuffle. But as far as the return of Bart and of Connor, not surprisingly, those are the moments that really just meant the most to me. And it's kind of crazy. Like, they both come back in this. Like, one would have been a delight, but to get both was really something. And, especially when Bart reappears and the boo, and he goes after Superboy Prime, and Superboy Prime is legitimately visibly scared of Bart after everything they went through in Infinite Crisis. So that really helps turn the tide. And of course, we had the setup for Bart's return. But as far as Connor's return, the way Connor ultimately comes back after dying in Infinite Crisis is that we have a team dispatched once again to present day 21st century DCU. We have Starman digging up Connor's body and off panel placing it in the Kryptonian rejuvenation matrix, or the chrysalis, in the fortress. And we also have another team going to Smallville and retrieving a strand of hair from a young Lex Luthor on the day he first started going bald. Because we need the Kryptonian rejuvenation matrix to handle the Kryptonian part of the resurrection, and we need Lex's DNA for the human part. And we see all of that converge in the 31st century. So the idea is that whereas Superman only needed a month-ish in the chamber after he died at the hands of Doomsday, Connor Kent spends 1,000 years undergoing this resurrection process, and then just has the most badass return as he punches Superboy Prime, deservedly so.
I yelled when I got to this page. My journey with Connor Kent was, it was kind of strange. At least I think it's strange. But I read Infinite Crisis. That was one of the first comics I started picking up after I jumped back on as a reader. So I saw him die. And then, I go back and I try to acquire all these issues and everything in the months and years since. So between Infinite Crisis and when I started working at a comic shop, I had acquired all of JOHNS' issues of Teen Titans and read that series voraciously. I just inhaled that book and absolutely loved it. And Connor quickly became my favorite member of that team. So I had already watched him die, and I could put these things together after the fact. I have developed a huge affection for Connor Kent, and lament the fact that he's not around. And then when that return finally happens, I can't tell you how joyful and satisfying it was to see him finally back after so long. So I love that moment to death, no pun intended. The return of Bart is struck similarly, largely because I think JOHNS did a good job of setting him up as Kid Flash in that Teen Titans book. Bart grew a lot in those issues, I think, particularly the first 15 or 20 of them. And so seeing him also come back over the course of this series just cemented how much fun of a blow off it was. Going back and looking at it now, it doesn't have the same punch, but it still has some punch to it. If you go back and you read the issues that changed these characters or separated them from us, and then you culminate it with these moments, it was perfect. It was absolutely fantastic. and I didn't care if there wasn't as much narrative complexity as the prior story. I can forgive it if it's given me these guys back.
I agree. I think the previous one, the themes were deeper and more resonant. Here, I think there's a higher degree of spectacle. When you go in knowing what to expect, that is reduced or diminished to at least some extent. So we don't have the splash, like, oh my God, I can't believe they're back. But no, I mean, I do remember reading that at the time, and like, it was a big deal. And the fact that it is that 1-2 punch of Bart and Connor is really something. And with Connor, and this is going to be a big part of where we're going on the podcast next year, because there's a lot I want to do with Connor. I know this is going to sound crazy, but like, I've never read his 90 series in its entirety. I've read probably about half of it. But I want to dive into all of it and then kind of track that evolution, because I love that Geoff Johns Teen Titans run as well. I always felt like, and this is what I'm curious to see if this changes as I reread it, because I always felt like Bart's transition from Impulse to Kid Flash, that rang true for me. Superboy, I always felt like he had a bit of a personality transplant at the beginning of that series, but he did have the revelation of where half his DNA came from, Lex Luthor. So there is something to account for it. Anyway, I'm excited to kind of go through all of that, what I haven't experienced, what I have, see how it all ties together. But we remember the first time Connor Kent appeared, and of course he wasn't even called Connor Kent then, and don't call me Superboy, it's Superman. And here, in this moment before we see him, one of the Legionnaires refers to him as, oh, we have another Superman. And he's like, no, call me Superboy. Like, just embracing the mantle and who he is. And, oh man. Yeah, no, it was so great. And I love the way he came back too. I thought that was a cool way to kind of harken back to Superman's own experience, but also put the Legion spin on it. Like, it's 1,000 years and he comes back in the future. I don't disagree with you, going back to what you were saying before about like the classic Legion characters and how much time they have. And I know we haven't poured over that. We focused on the super side of all of this appropriately so, I think. But, you know, there are some of the dynamics at play. There is the romance between, or the strained romance between Wildfire and Dawnstar. Sunboy, after everything he went through when he was imprisoned by the Justice League, you know, he's really kind of very down on himself during the story, but ultimately kind of gets his mojo back. And then the founders of the Legion, Lightning Lad, Cosmic Boy, Saturn Girl, they ultimately play a critical role going up against the Time Trapper towards the climax of the story. So it was nice to see the three of them together. And as we've said, Time Trapper reveals himself to be an older Superboy Prime. But as I was getting at, there's this interesting idea that Brainiac poses, that Time Trapper is really essentially like a sentient alternate timeline who's rebelling against whatever's going on and takes different forms, which I love, because it's, as I was reading this, I said to myself, like, what the hell is the Time Trapper's deal? Because I feel like I've read so many, like Zero Hour, like he's always somebody different. I'm like, what is going on here? And I feel like that was a very elegant solution to that. And I can go along with it. And ultimately, the team brings the older Superboy Prime, aka the Time Trapper, and the present Superboy Prime into contact. And when Superboy Prime goes to clock his older self, that collision essentially shunts both of them out of this current realm of existence.
There's something about those Superboy Prime punches, isn't there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Punching the walls of continuity. But for the record, never in the pages of Infinite Crisis itself. We always have to remember that.
That's true. Absolutely. No, I mean, you know, you do a really good job of recapping everything, and it does emphasize the simplicity of this story relative to at least the previous one. Lightning Saga had a degree of complexity to it, if for no other reason than the mechanics that actually brought Wally back are a little convoluted. But either way, I mean, I do think that this does provide a pretty effective endpoint for the entirety of the story thus far. Obviously, there are a few things that happen after the primes are separated, of course. But you know, setting things up in a way that allows Superman to kind of learn something from the experience, but also manage to push the DCU narrative a little forward, I found really rewarding. The Green Lantern elements of this story I thought were awesome. And they play no small part in the ultimate resolution in the final conflict. So there was a lot here. There was a lot here. I don't think it gets as much credit as it deserves. It doesn't seem like it's talked about very much these days.
I hope. And, one of the things that's been very cool over this podcast generally, but especially over these Superboy episodes, I've heard from a lot of people who have been checking out what we've been talking about. I mean, I had people watching the Superboy TV show who had never watched it. So the fact that people are listening to us talk about these things and then want to check them out, like that's great. Like I love that. And for Final Crisis, it is, normally I rant about the app, but it is available on the app, on the DC app. So you can read it there, and it is collected if you have, or if you're interested in getting the Final Crisis Omnibus, it's there as well. So, it's not as easily available as you and I would like, but it is out there. And sure. I do hope people will check it out. There's also, again, there's a lot going on in the story, but, one of the key Superman aspects that I'd be remiss if we signed off not at least mentioning is that Superman articulates this desire to try to find some redemption for Superboy Prime. Like always seeing the best in people. He calls him Clark when they clash, right? He's like trying to appeal to his humanity, despite everything that he's done. So I love that. And it really is perfect that you're here because I agree. I think this trilogy certainly has a proper conclusion with Legion of Three Worlds, but there are threads that continue. Superboy Prime being a great example of that. I was going to say a prime example, being a great example of that. I know he has a couple of issues in Adventure Comics after this that tie into Blackest Night, because this story ends with Superboy Prime powerless and essentially under house arrest on Earth Prime. So he made it back to this world that he was always clamoring for. But he's essentially become this deranged fanboy, and his parents live in fear of him, and he seemingly has killed Laurie. And you see him on the DC message boards. So I'll be honest, I never loved that angle for the character. I felt like that was a little bit much for my taste, kind of painting him as this, again, just raging fanboy, but it was a lane. It was a lane for the character. But anyway, so he ends up on Earth Prime. We see him in that Adventure Comics, a two-parter. I know he has appearances towards the end of that Teen Titans series, long after Geoff Johns has left, but I know he gets pulled into that, pulled away from his world, and he has a few issues there. I know he pops up in the Geoff Johns Shazam series that he did. And then the most recent, I don't think there's been anything after this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but this is what you and I talked about when we did Death Metal. He has his redemption arc in Death Metal, where he steps up and saves the day, seemingly at the cost of his life, and then he's kind of rewarded with a new start, essentially on his Earth, and then we see him lifting a car at the end of it. So he does have an arc, and over the course of all these episodes, we're focusing on Clark as Superboy. And I know technically Superboy Prime is also Clark, but we're focusing on the one true Clark Kent, because Superboy Prime is kind of his own thing. And we've talked about him, here and there. But there's that thread. And then the other thread that you and I also talked about was in Legion of Three Worlds, not all of the Legionnaires are found and recovered. There are some who are missing. And this comes into play in the New Krypton storyline that you joined me for last year. And we find there are these Legionnaires who have been living undercover in present-day Metropolis and Smallville, integrating themselves into the lives of Mon-El and Connor Kent. And this all kind of plays into that final battle on Kandor. So again, I think we get a very satisfying conclusion in Legion of Three Worlds. There are threads that continue, but we have talked about them here on this podcast, and you were here for that.
Yeah. And it's just, I love the long sort of vision that Johns seemed to have for this character. I mean, I don't know if the ultimate resolution that was displayed or depicted in Death Metal is necessarily how he thought things would shake out, but he always seems to have something interesting to say with him. And here, weaving him into this, it really does help to magnify, particularly at this time, his petulance and his hubris, always thinking that he's got this one step ahead of things. And then when we do see him later in those Blackest Night issues, I mean, that's a really interesting two-part story, the art by Jerry Ordway. It's absolutely worth reading. But I wasn't necessarily angered by the depiction of him as a fanboy at the end of this one, as much as I was mostly just thinking about the dynamic of, wow, his family seems familiar with everything that he's done. They went back and they read the comics where these stories are published, at some point was able to deduce that it was actually him. And then when he comes back, they're holding all of that stuff against him. That, I think, distracted me from the fanboyishness that he was exhibiting, because that introduces like a whole new mechanism of exploring the DC universe, really, like this very metatextual way of including the narrative structure from a real world perspective in the context of your shared fictional universe. That's doing a lot of it's doing a lot of heavy lifting, and I still find it really interesting.
Right on. Did this make you more interested in going back and checking out the reboot or the threeboot runs?
Maybe the threeboot to a degree, because I feel like the threeboot got a little bit more service that gave me kind of an idea about some aspects of who they were, but didn't really engender any interest in the post 0 hour version, outside of just like a novel curiosity about the history of the team.
I had the kind of the opposite. So we'll see. It's one of these things, we do enough of these episodes. I'm sure, not too long from now, I'll be announcing my Legion of Superheroes run of episodes. But it definitely made me a little bit more keen. Like I said, I at least have some experience with threeboot, but the post 0 hour team, that's the one, again, that's the first one I met, Final Night. Like, I don't know, there's part of me that would be kind of curious. So that might be in the cards at some point. But it's a beautiful, like Legion of Three Worlds, you and I clearly got a lot out of it. And I would imagine, I would love to hear from the true diehard Legion fans who might be listening to this, because even if I'm sure you wanted more moments and more spotlight on individual characters or subgroups or whatnot, but still to have all three legions and the Legion of Supervillains, like to have everyone represented in this way, I mean, it seems like such a treat. So, hopefully Legion fans felt, well served by this story.
Hopefully. Yeah. I would like to think that some of them were, at least. There's something to be said about the power of a story with creators of this caliber, or these calibers, if you don't consider them in different classes. The marketing that does to just get more people into the guys that you like, the group that you like. So on that basis, I hope that it's not seen as like a footnote. I think that it played kind of an important part in perpetuating new interest in the Legion. And don't we want to make new fans of the things that we like at the end of the day?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if this is something you can answer. I'll have to do my own research and maybe folks can reach out, but it's like, we had the New 52 Legion, and I never read any of that. And then in the Rebirth era, Bendis put his own spin on the Legion, the version of the team that John Kent was with. Do you know? I'm curious enough to ask you and pose the question. Clearly, I wasn't curious enough to go on Wikipedia and try to read about this myself. But do you like the New 52 and the Bendis Legions? Are they one of these legions, or connected to one, or are they each their own thing?
I was under the impression that they were each their own thing. Just because it seems like Legion is a property that DC is really comfortable with making really clean breaks from on time to time, at least if history is any indication. But I was under the impression, and it might be the mistaken impression, that both of those were separate instances.
Well, stay tuned for Legion of Five Worlds in 2030. No, but
there you go.
Is there?
Perfect.
But I guess I just bring that up to say, like, this moment, I feel like this trilogy and this half a decade stretch, it just captures a moment in time, because again, to my knowledge, like, it's not like we've had these three legions converge ever again. It's like, this was it, I think.
Yeah.
And probably will be, I mean, you never know, but at least for the time being. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about? Anything they're like, I can't believe we didn't get to this. I got to talk about this.
No, I think we were pretty comprehensive, all things considered. I guess the only final parting thought that I have is just, these stories should not be slept on. If you haven't taken the time to absorb them before, I would definitely encourage it, particularly if you don't even have all that much familiarity with the Legion, because these are very much designed to at least get you feeling something about them. And it's got a really low barrier to entry from that first story. And if you're interested in exploring that kind of segment of Superman's history, it's a larger one than is often given credit for. And if that's your window into it, then by all means, take it.
Amen. Look, the Meltzer run on Justice League, that year that he did, that includes this crossover, that I would recommend to anybody. And there was a deluxe edition hardcover collecting the whole thing. It's out of print now, I believe. But if you can get your hands on that, or it's on the app, I mean, that's available. But that is well worth reading, even if you just read that. Even if you just read Superman and the Legion. Again, I think that one really stands on its own, and you get a very accessible Superman story that weaves in this history with the Legion in a very compelling way. Legion of Three Worlds, I would definitely not recommend that on its own. Like if you don't have a background in these characters, unless you're so intrigued by what we're talking about. But like if you do make it through those first two, or read the third chapter. And again, even if you're like, oh my God, I can't make heads or tails of all these Legionnaires, neither can I. Like there's a lot of characters floating around, and you just kind of like, you just ride that wave, and you focus on the ones that you know or are of interest to you, and know that you're going to get Superman, you're going to get Connor Kent, you're going to get Bar. Like there's a lot there, I think, depending on what your frame of reference is. So I echo what you said wholeheartedly. What do you want to tell folks about the Comic Binge and your other podcast endeavors?
Oh, thank you very much. Again, really appreciate the invitation. I love these stories. I hope I effectively communicated that, and appreciate the chance to get to talk about them. You can check my social media materials is just at Chris Clow, CHRISCLOW, on various platforms. If it's in there, then you can probably find me there. The Comic Binge is going to be reviewing Deadpool and Wolverine pretty soon from the time that we're recording this. And we've got new episodes of the subseries Knights Never Die that are coming out with me and my friend Javi Trujillo, exploring Grant Morrison's Batman run issue by issue. It's really fun. We're about to take a slight detour into Arkham Asylum, which is arguably a pretty important chapter for other elements explored in the run prior to Batman R.I.P. And then there's Discovery Debrief, a Star Trek podcast where we talk about Star Trek. We're a little bit on a break right now just because the franchise isn't very active, but we are planning to get together pretty soon to talk about Star Trek Prodigy Season 2 that's on Netflix right now, and pretty soon to talk about the upcoming season of Lower Decks, the animated series. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone will check that out. Every time you're here, I know I always keep you so long, but I appreciate your time and your insight. And I mean, like, again, these are, to varying degrees, but some fairly dense, complex works. And so, to have someone who, has the interest and can articulate these ideas, that we're talking about, it's having you here as a guest really is a treat. So I thank you, and I always enjoy talking with you.
Likewise. Thank you very much for the invite. I appreciate it.
Awesome. And I guess the last thing I'll say in parting is that, out of all the Superboy episodes we've done so far, this one is an outlier because it builds off of Clark's history as Superboy, but like he's not Superboy in these stories. Like this is the first one we've looked like in all the episodes we've done so far. I don't know what we're up to, chapter 14. I don't know in this. Check the show notes. But like this one is Superman, right? But obviously building on all of that. So it's just kind of interesting. But I thank you, Chris. I thank you, audience. Next week, we'll be getting into Superman Secret Origin. Now, we've touched on this, obviously, in this episode and many times when we've talked about the various tellings of the Superman origin, but this will be a dedicated episode all about Superman Secret Origin by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank. And while it's not the end of a Superboy fan journey, I think will really kind of bring home a lot of what we're talking about, what we've been talking about before we segue into our final act, which we'll get to soon. So thank you all. Keep tuning in. And as always, it's about what you do. It's about action. This podcast is an affiliate of BCW Supplies. The next time you need to restock on comic book bags, boards, boxes, and more, be sure to use promo code FSP to save 10% on your order. That's FSP for Flat Squirrel Productions. It helps support the show too. Be sure to check out our sister podcast series, Another Exciting Episode in the Adventures of Superman, an episode-by-episode breakdown of the classic George Reeves television show, available wherever you get podcasts. Please join us on social media, become a patron, and subscribe, rate, and review today. Links are in the show notes. Thank you all.